Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a quick look at how to print images from TouchDesigner, and that's using any printer. And this is something that I think is pretty useful, and we'll touch on a couple other good topics and skills, like extensions, the engine comp, and using some command line tools. So here we have just a generative visual. Here we have our print talks that we'll be working on today. And the idea is that I'm able to just click print, and with no frame drops or anything really going on the TouchDesigner side, my external printer just starts printing right away. So the technique that we're going to use is Windows-based. Although there are analogs for Mac, you can use a lot of the same steps, but you won't be able to use the specific software package that we're going to use to do this nicely. Because that's only for Windows, unfortunately. So that's a caveat, but the broad strokes should be the same. And so before we get into the TouchDesigner side, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, the infrastructure that we're going to need and kind of why we're using this method as opposed to some of the other methods that are around. So, for example, if you just Google, how do I print from a command line, you get a couple options, and a lot of these options don't work very well because you can't give print options with your solution. You can't change the printer or a number of other things that make it not really useful if what you're going for is being able to print out something that is kind of full bleed with some special print options. And so the solution that I found when I was working on a project that required this recently is to use a third-party software called IrfanView, which is a super lightweight graphic viewing app. And it is what I use for mostly just kind of like picture management, batch renaming, file conversions, just viewing images and everything. It's phenomenal as a Windows image viewer. And one of the great things is that IrfanView command line options. There are a lot of command line options that you get with IrfanView. And one of those right here is printing, and even printing with a specific printer in mind. What's better is that using IrfanView to print is going to allow us to set some default options using a UI, and then just print using those default options every time. So we can do things like, let's say, change the orientation of our output or stretch it to fit and do things that make it print very nicely in a way that's much more, frankly, user-friendly and less coding than some of the other solutions which involve doing some crazier stuff. So I really like this software package just anyway, and the fact that I can use it nicely from TouchDesigner to print stuff is a little bit of a cherry on top. So before we get into the TouchDesigner side, I'm going to go through the IrfanView kind of flow, and we'll just start to understand a little bit about what we're doing, and then we'll jump into the TouchDesigner portion, which should be pretty short. So first, make sure you download the appropriate version of IrfanView for your system, and then you can go and basically just open up a file. So this is the image that I just saved, opened in IrfanView. And first, I'm just going to do Control P, and that's going to bring up this print dialog. Now, I think the default looks something like this. We can see that my image is not at all going to be printing out the way that I want it to. And so I'm going to change to landscape for my needs and stretch to fit. And so that way, I'm going to have a nice fitted image that's exactly the dimensions of my paper. You could, of course, like rescale the output inside of TouchDesigner before you do this step, but for our tutorial purposes, I think this should be fine. And so then I will just click print, and we'll see that this is starting to go. So that's good. It means that our print job is working and that we've now set the default options for our print. So that's kind of step one. IrfanView is working. Now what I need to do is go back to the command line options and figure out how I can use this print command line option and print via that. And so we want to do it outside of TouchDesigner and everything first. So I'm just going to open up my File Explorer and open a terminal. Actually, this is PowerShell, not command line. So we'll need to open, open a command prompt and then navigate to the directory that we are in. And so I think that for me, let's make sure, where am I at here? Yep. And okay, so here is the folder that I'm in, and we can see I have my image2.jpg that I just saved. And so if we go to our command line options again and scroll down a little bit, they give us some nice examples, and one of those examples is for printing. So it looks like we need the file path to our IrfanView executable, and then we pass the path to the image that we want printed, and then we pass this /print command. Optionally, we can add a printer name, and so we can just kind of try and port this over to our command line. One thing we'll need is to figure out where our IrfanView installation is, and that's likely going to be in your PC program files, IrfanView, and then right here we have the I_view64, not that one, this one, I_view64 application. That's the path that we need. So I'm going to copy this path. I'm going to then, let me see if I can get the example maybe up here, so we can see all of this at once. So this is the example that I'm trying to emulate here. So first I'm going to copy and paste my path, and then just add the actual executable path, which is I_view64.exe. And then next is going to be path to my file. And because I'm already in this printer directory, I can just type image img-2.jpg. That is going to be different depending on what your image file is. And then we simply type /print. And in this case, I'm also going to say equals, and my printer name is dp-q410. And you can always figure that out. If I turn off this for a second, you can always figure that out by going to the device manager and looking at printers and opening up properties. And so we can see that the device name is dp-q4 or qw410. And so let's get this back up, and our command line as well. And then I'll get my printer display back. Okay, and so that's where I got my dp-qw410. And so now when I hit enter, we hope that this starts printing for us. And indeed, it did, with no application visibly opening or anything like that. We're just kind of printing in the background using this command line process, which is great. It's exactly what we need, and it's going to give us the tools to be able to then run this process from TouchDesigner. The only missing piece is how to actually run command line commands from TouchDesigner. And we're going to do that through Python, because that's the best way. And so what we really need is some way to use command line options for Python. And we can do that with the Python subprocess, which is this Python subprocess module, which will essentially allow us to import subprocess and then run some command line versions from Python specifically. So we're going to import this module, and that's going to be kind of how we implement this command line and run it from TouchDesigner. So now that we kind of understand what we need to do, we can boil down our TouchDesigner work into how can we build a little setup that's going to save an image, then use this subprocess module to execute a command line based on the image file, and send it to our printer. So I'm going to go back to TouchDesigner now, and we can get into some of the meat of this. Now, I'm going to simply get rid of this entire extension, and we'll rebuild it from scratch. Or rather, entire component, and we will rebuild it from scratch. So I'm going to insert a base, and I'm going to call that base print. Now, what we're going to need to do is save our image, and then print that image. And so I'm going to have another base in here. You'll see the reason for this in a second. And this can be called, like, maybe save and print. Okay, and then what is save and print going to do? It's going to have a parameter that's going to be called print. We'll make that a pulse parameter. You can open this component editor by right-clicking anywhere in the network and customizing parent component option. This toolbar is the function store toolbar, which you can do the same thing by just right-clicking here. You can grab that for free on his GitHub. It's phenomenal, super helpful, highly recommend. So we have this parameter. I'm going to drop a parameter chop and grab the print parameter. I'm going to then have a chop execute. And this chop execute is going to actually do some of our saving. Now, where I'm going with this, and the reason that we're doing this inside of a base, again, is because we're going to use whatever base we create here inside of an engine comp to be able to run this without dropping any frames. And the reason that I mention that now is because I would ordinarily do what I'm about to do in an extension, but sometimes I find that engine comps work a little bit better if you don't use an extension and instead try to just kind of implement your logic in a chop execute style. I'm sure there's some way to kind of get around that, but for our purposes right now, I think this is going to be more than enough. So I will add a null in here, and I'm going to call that null img for image, and then I will edit the contents of this. So this is going to be a chopx to save and print a top on demand. Okay, so first we need to save, then we need to print, and before we save, actually, we need to get file info. And we also know that our image is always going to be that op image, so I'm going to declare that outside of my function. It's a little bit more optimized. And so then we can start to fill this in. Now, I know that I'm going to want a file path for my image, and this is going to be what we save to. And so, and maybe also we'll want to designate a printer. So I'm going to default that printer to my dp-qw410, but that could obviously be whatever printer you have. And my file path, I'm going to default to just temp.jpg. And so if we open up our parent parameters, we can see those here, which is great. and nothing's happening yet, but I need to turn on the off to on my chop. Nothing's happening yet because we're not actually doing anything, but our pipes are working. And so now in my VS Code, my file info, I'm going to say file path equals, and here we'll reference that parent parameter, parent.par.filepath. This autocomplete is coming from Copilot, which I probably should turn off, but haven't yet. So just bear with me there. And then the other one we need is the printer, and so we'll want to use parent.par.printer to get that. And then we can always just print this as a test, and file path will print to printer like this, and now we'll open up a text port, and when I click pulse, we will hope that we see that little string. And there you go. So it looks like things are working. Now we'll save this file. I'm going to get rid of the print statement. And now we'll save file. And so that is done with image.save, and we'll save it to the file path. And now here's where we need to use that Python subprocess module. And so we will import subprocess. And then what we're going to do is use the run command. Subprocess.run, and this is going to be an F string. And so in here, we're going to recreate the options, or we're going to recreate the command line command that we passed through the command prompt. So basically this whole thing. So I'm just going to copy that here. And now we can start to parameterize. So this is going to be constant and really won't change based on the computer installation. You could probably pull this out and parameterize it to have a more portable tox. So it is worth knowing that if it's a different location, you will need to update that, but I'm not going to parameterize that for this. What I will parameterize is this, which we will pass our file path, and then the dash print is going to stay, but I'm going to then parameterize this dp-q410 with a reference to our printer variable. So whatever's inside these curly brackets will be replaced with a string of the evaluated variable. And so we're basically going to be passing our file path variable into here and our printer name into here. And this subprocess print from command line with IrfanView. The subprocess module is then going to execute that command line command whenever we hit this pulse. And so if we did everything right, what we will hope to see is a print come out. And I guess maybe I will print a statement that can say something like successfully printed file path to printer. And I understand the autocomplete's here, but I'm going to try and type everything just for completeness, because I understand not everybody's going to have autocomplete capabilities. And so that should work when we press this print. I would expect to see a line coming printed out here saying successfully printed, and then we should see this start. Okay, so that did work. Our print did start, but if you caught it, I dropped a bunch of frames. And that was for a combination of the saving and the printing. We obviously don't want that if we're doing real-time stuff, and so that is why we need to use something like an extension, or rather an engine, to implement this. So I'm going to save this component. I'm going to save it as a save and print tox, and then I'm going to delete it here. Now instead, I'm going to use an engine comp, and I'm going to point this engine comp at my save and print. This is going to load up that same tox, just in a separate process. And that's going to allow me to do that same save and print, but this time we're not going to be dropping any frames. And what's better, we can still use that same file path and printer parameters, and also this print, and we can kind of use these just like we would. For example, if I change this from temp to image, and then hit print, we got no frame drops that time, and our printer's starting. So that's exactly the activity that we were hoping to see. And if I go to the File Explorer and go back to this directory, this image file is the one that we just created, so we can see that our file path name is working. Now I'm gonna name this engine comp save and print in all caps, and that will allow me to reference it a little bit easier. And so the last thing that we need to do is kind of give ourselves just a little bit of flexibility, and I'm going to use an extension to be able to do that. So I'm going to open up that component editor again. Now this time I'm working in the print tox. And so I will have an extension, I'll call it print extension, I will add it, and then I will edit it, and we'll pull up this VS Code editor. There we go. And so we don't need to do a ton with this print extension, but basically we want to give ourselves just like a little bit of a wrapper that's going to make our lives a little bit easier and allow us to interact with this printing from maybe elsewhere in the system. So I'm going to, open my parent parameters here and give my print tox a global app shortcut called print. And then in the extension, I'm going to have a capital function called print, and that's so that we can access it from outside of the component itself. And it's going to take a couple arguments. It'll take a file path and a printer argument. Now, we can add some defaults. So we can say self.default printer equals dp-qw410, again for me, and self.default file equals temp.jpg. So then in our extension, we can actually use or turn these into keyword arguments and default them to none. So that way, if we pass something, it will be passed. If we don't pass anything, we get a none. And so then we can say if file path is none, file path will equal our self.default file path. And if printer is none, printer equals self.default printer. And so that will basically just allow us to either override these or just use our defaults, which will be set up in this extension. Now we need to set parameters on engine comp. And so for that, I'm going to add another member here, and that'll be self.printEngine. And that'll be a reference to self.ownercomp.op, save, and print. Reference to this. And then we can use self.printEngine, printengine.par.filepath.val equals file path, and self.printengine.par.printer equals printer. And then all we have to do is print. And so for that, we say self.printengine.par.print.pulse. So it doesn't seem like we just changed a whole lot, because now I'm basically going to just add another print pulse. Pulse. And I'm basically going to recreate that same little chain, just grabbing this print parameter and a chop execute. But this time, I'm going to be following actual best practices. And so on our off to on, I'm going to just reference the extension. And so I'm going to say parent.print. And because I'm not referencing anything or not passing any parameters in to this function, our defaults will be passed, which means they will be read as none, and then we will set our file path and printer equal to the defaults that we have configured in the extension. Now, we could say something like file path equals, how about test.jpg, and that will then print out or save to a file called test.jpg and then print that. So let's give that a shot. Make sure our chop execute is turned on for off to on. And then let's see what happens with our parent parameters when we press print. And if I open the text port, oh, I took out the print statement, so I guess that doesn't really matter anymore. And yeah, so we can see that worked. Our print is coming out of the printer, no frames were dropped, and now we basically have the ability to, like I said, name our print anything. And what's great about that, and the reason that I wanted to set it up like this, is because now you have the ability to kind of access this printing functionality from any extension anywhere in your network. So if you have something like user sessions or data-driven events or something like that, and you want to have information that's passed along your network and kind of used elsewhere but still be able to print, we can use this handy function anywhere. So for example, let's say that I want to have my image increment every time. So we'll save it as like image 1, then image 2, then image 3, then image 4. So an easy way to implement something like that using this paradigm would be let's say add a variable called, or a parameter called image count on our parent. And then in here in our extension, we'll say every time we print, we'll have that count go up. And so count can be equal to self.ownercomp.par.imageCount. Count plus equals 1, and then self.ownercomp.par.imageCount.val equals ct. So here we're basically just adding 1, and so every time we press print, that parameter will go up. And then the way that we can implement that in our code is by using an f string here in our file naming and referencing parent.par.imageCount there. And so now when I click print, that image count increased, and we can see that my image is now named test-0. So you can similarly have advanced image naming and have each of these parameters kind of be like a user-specific data point, like the name or the session number or whatever. And by adding a bunch of these parameters, and you can then set these parameters from extensions elsewhere in your network, like every time you get a WebSocket hit or an OSC message or anything like that, you could take the OSC message, update, let's say, the image count, or even file name, which can be a string. And then instead of having our test in here, we could actually just parameterize this and use our parent.par.filename as the file name. And so now whatever we have in here is going to be the name of our file. And so you can take an OSC message or a WebSocket message that has a file name or some unique identifier or whatever. You can say my file name from OSC. And then when we hit print, obviously that same thing happens, and we have an image that's called my file name from OSC, and it gets printed out. So using this method, you can start to really kind of have a very configurable and scalable approach for printing. I think this is also a very good general approach to know about when working with extensions and engines in general. So hopefully this was some good practice using those concepts. And now you have the ability to print any image from TouchDesigner to any printer that you have. So, oh yeah, I guess that will say the last thing is, let's say you had a bunch of printers and maybe you had like multiple screens and each screen was supposed to print to a specific printer. You could get OSC messages or WebSockets that contained the information from the screen as well, or rather from the printer. And so you could always do that same method and parameterize the printer as well. So just another way that you can configure it. I think this is a good place to stop this video. I feel pretty good with what we've accomplished, and hopefully now you're feeling a little bit more confident using extensions, using engines, using command line options from TouchDesigner with Python, and know that printing stuff from TouchDesigner is pretty easy. So thank you all for your support, and until next time, happy creating and take care.